Imagine if the infrastructure gap between African countries reduced so immensely that the inter-African regional trade moved from the current 15% to a clean 40% or even 50%. Imagine if your goods could move up from East Africa to North and West Africa seamlessly, trade across the African borders effortlessly like the click of a button. I revolutionized science and technology to support trade and industrialization accessible across most, if not all, African countries. Or better yet, just imagine resilient infrastructure so solid and long-lasting that you could almost forget how poor infrastructure looks like. Now, I bet you have heard of the existing, ongoing and planned infrastructure projects in Africa with the aim of achieving great development for the future. But a main challenge constantly lacking is the lack of infrastructure to support visions such as the African Union Vision 2063, Africa's blueprint and master plan for transforming Africa into a global powerhouse of the future. Well, the Lamu Port South Sudan-Ethiopia Transport Corridor is a flagship project which mirrors the continent's development agenda and aspirations under the AU's Agenda 2063 with a great capacity to transform Africa through the development, infrastructure and trade. But how?
If you look at Africa, Africa right now is on a path towards integration, towards peace, and towards sustainable socio-economic development. And these are the renewed efforts of the African Union, especially under the Agenda 2063. If you look at the LAPSSET corridor project, it captures most of the aspirations of the Agenda 2063. For example, we have a prosperous Africa, which is based on inclusivity and sustainable development. The LAPSSET corridor project on the Kenyan side is an enabler of our long-term Vision 2030, which ensures that there is equal distribution of resources for all the citizens. For example, traversing through the north and northeastern parts of Kenya, they have been underdeveloped for quite a while. But now, under the LAPSSET project, we want to see, especially on the economic corridor, social services, schools, hospitals, security, water provision, electricity, and ICT entering into the corridor and allowing the people to be able to compete with the rest of the world. The other aspiration of Agenda 2063 is, of course, integrating Africa. And this is integrating Africa through hard infrastructure and also soft infrastructure. We take soft infrastructure, for example, we want to come up with the best policies that will be able to spur trade. We also want to come up with this ideology where Africa as a continent has a common history, has a common agenda, common goals, and is headed towards a common destiny so that we are not divided by our borders, but we can be able to freely trade and to interact and to promote this Pan-Africanism. Moreover, then, we also have the hard infrastructure. We are talking about now the robust transport infrastructure. Under LAPSSET, we want to do kilometers, thousands of kilometers of roads connecting the port of Lamu to the hinterland markets of Kenya and also the landlocked country of South Sudan and Ethiopia. And moreover, we want to have this integrated infrastructure cutting across the east coast of Africa to the west coast of Africa, what we call the equatorial land bridge. And we have that connectivity that would be able to spur trade between the African countries in that region. We also want, in the long term, to integrate the south coast of Africa to the north coast of Africa through the Trans-African Highway. So we'll be able to bring together very many economic blocks and a population of about 800 million people who will now be able to freely move and trade and interact under the soft infrastructure that I talked about. And I think in the long term, that is how the LAPSSET corridor project will be able to benefit the African continent.
The Lamu Port South Sudan-Ethiopia Transport Corridor is Kenya's new strategic transport and economic corridor that runs from the port of Lamu to the landlocked countries of Ethiopia and South Sudan. LAPSSET was commissioned in 2012 by the heads of state of Kenya, South Sudan and Ethiopia to promote trade and economic growth in the region. This transport and economic corridor is part of Kenya's Vision 2030, a long-term project blueprint for the country, which will promote equal distribution of resources to all Kenyans, promote efficient movement of people and goods, as well as social-economic transformation in the country. The corridor will also play a huge role as a link between the east coast of Africa and the west coast of Africa through the proposed East-West Trans-Africa Beltway Corridor Initiative and the Trans-African Cape to Cairo Highway, connecting to the south coast of Africa to the northern parts of Africa. Among the key components of the LAPSSET project include Lamu Port, highways, international airports, a standard gauge railway, crude and product oil pipeline, resort cities, High Grand Falls power generation dam, water supply lines and fiber optic cable.
The Port of Lamu is what is able to make a case for the LAPSSET Corridor project. It connects the hinterland markets of Kenya and the markets in South Sudan and Ethiopia efficiently through the LAPSSET Corridor all the way to the Port of Lamu and enable these countries to participate in global trade. So it was very important for us to develop the Port of Lamu and to begin to create meaning to the LAPSSET Corridor project. So far, we have been able to develop the first 3 berths at a cost of about 50 billion Kenya shillings, purely funded by government. And this was a very good strategy to show the world that we are serious, to show the world that LAPSSET Corridor project is a key priority for the government. So that was done. The first 3 berths are completed and is able to handle trade and business. The other infrastructure project that we saw was important to do is, of course, the road connectivity. We needed roads to be able to evacuate cargo from the Port of Lamu and to serve the markets which we have targeted, that being Ethiopia and South Sudan and the hinterland markets of Kenya. And we have been able to do significant progress. We have roads which are stretching all the way from the Port of Lamu, connecting all the way to Addis Ababa and the hinterland markets of Kenya, going all the way to the border with South Sudan. That, to us, we felt was also a very important project that we needed to do. We also needed to develop the one-stop border post, and we have been able to successfully complete the one-stop border post in Moyale. That is the border between Kenya and Ethiopia, and that now is facilitating trade in a very simplified and in a very efficient manner. And now we can begin to see cargo moving in and out of the country, and we are able to trade with Ethiopia. Now, the other projects which we have been able to develop, especially to spur trade and economic development, such as Isiolo Airport, which was completed in 2017. It can be able to handle about 125,000 passengers a year. This airport was specifically designed to handle the tourism potential of the corridor, where tourists can be able to land and enjoy all the scenic beauty and all that the LAPSSET Corridor has to offer in terms of tourism, and be able to go back to their various destinations. Also, in the short-term projects, we have the crude oil pipeline. You know, Kenya discovered about 600 million barrels of oil in Turkana, and we are looking to see how we can be able to evacuate that oil and export it to be refined and sold into different markets. Now, going forward, and what is in the planning process right now, is the development of a high-speed electric railway that will connect, of course, the Port of Lamu to Ethiopia, South Sudan, and even stretch across Africa through the connections that I have mentioned. We also have resort cities because of the tourism potential that we have in this corridor. We also want to develop international airports in the long term when we see that kind of demand coming into the corridor to enjoy all this tourism and business opportunities that will be thriving because of this LAPSSET corridor. International airports are things that we have planned in the long term. Special economic zones too are things that we have in the mid to long term. We are looking at a corridor that is endowed with various natural resources that we can be able to add value and establish value chains for processing and exportation to global markets and trading with one another in the African continent. Africa is come to a time where it must industrialize, and we want to sustainably harness the natural resources in the corridor, whether it's the blue economy, livestock, natural resources, oil and gas. We want to be able to exploit these natural resources and industrialize, have value addition and high quality goods for Africa that we can begin to trade amongst one another. And then we will be able to see the kind of benefits we want, especially regarding the quality of life for the citizens in Kenya, the region, and the continent.
Accessibility of goods from source to markets facilitates trade and commerce, therefore improving the economy. In simple terms, a seamless, connected Africa.